Hello everyone, and welcome to Supporting Personalised and Distance Learning Across Europe with New Technologies, the latest in a series of webinars brought to you in partnership between Times Higher Education and Google Cloud. My name is Alistair Lawrence, I'm the Special Projects Editor at THE, and I'm joined today by a panel of leaders from higher education and industry, who are Marie Clark, Dean of Undergraduate Studies, University College Dublin, Tracy Lightfoot, Pro Vice Chancellor for Teaching, Learning and Students at the University of York, Alejandro Armelini, who's Dean of Digital and Distributed Learning at the University of Portsmouth, Jim Levy, who's Head of Higher Education Manager for the UK and Ireland for Google Cloud. As universities' digital transformation continues at pace, personalised and distance learning are becoming more closely integrated and increasingly important components of the higher education offering. I'll now hand over to Jim for a presentation that outlines how Google Cloud's latest work is supporting universities in this area. Jim, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I will just share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen now. And yeah, thank you everybody. Sorry. So good afternoon, and I'd like to add my welcome to the webinar, and we're delighted that you've joined us. My name is Jim Levi, and I'm responsible for higher education in the UK and Ireland here at Google Cloud. In the session today, we're excited to share some of the tools that Google's created to support universities and enable students to succeed. And this is in the context of you facing the many and varied challenges driven by changing expectations, technology, and of course the pandemic. We're also excited to share Google Cloud's vision for how cloud technology can support and augment university staff, freeing them up to focus on their own research and directly supporting students. I'll be speaking for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion. So we see, and I guess everybody attending this webinar sees, that universities are faced with some pretty significant challenges at the moment. Firstly, to attract and retain students, universities have to innovate with new technologies to deliver the kind of seamless, personalised, real-time experiences that students expect. Second, universities are now expected to play a much larger pastoral care role than before. To intervene before it's too late, you have to capture insight about your students at scale and identify students at risk in their early stages of disengagement. And third, particularly as a result of COVID, universities have had to radically implement a new or significantly expanded IT infrastructure to support and enable online distance learning. So in short, to remain competitive and relevant, universities are faced with solving all kinds of new problems and adapting to meet new challenges, as ever, of course, with limited funding. At the heart of solving for these challenges, we believe, is technology. And two key parts to this are, first of all, a robust IT infrastructure that's easy to scale, provides intuitive experiences, and facilitates the learning experience rather than restricts it. And second, data capture and powerful artificial intelligence that can help support students in a personalised way and can effectively identify struggling students in a scalable way so that staff have time to focus where it matters most. Google Cloud's vision is very much rooted in the idea that technology doesn't replace humans, it assists or augments them, and that technology should reduce the time people spend on basic tasks and then free them up for what really matters. And technology should also provide support in new ways, like the ability to give 24/7 real-time support and access, for example. And this comes to life in our Student Success Services platform. Student Success Services is a set of modular, highly flexible IT solutions that enable universities to provide more personalized, flexible learning experiences in a scalable and cost-effective way. There are three main parts that I'll discuss today. The first is an innovative artificial intelligence-powered tutor for personalized learning, which gives students real-time academic support as they're studying or writing to augment their learning. Then we look at AI-powered 24/7 virtual support that helps students get answers quickly and frees up staff time to focus on more personal student guidance. And then finally, Google Workspace and virtual desktops provide the infrastructure for what we call scalable distance learning, providing not only wider access to learning, but also replicating on-campus learning experiences as closely as possible in the online environment. Let's start with the AI tutor for personalized learning. Students needing academic support is obviously nothing new, and students working hard or needing help at 11 o'clock at night is also nothing new. But what has changed are some student expectations and what's possible. Students now would ideally like flexible, responsive support as and when they need it. And universities are faced with the challenge of providing this help without overloading staff time and without breaking the bank. Universities also face pressure to make the learning environment more accessible to people from different backgrounds, which means building in layers of support in a scalable and cost-effective way. Google Cloud's developed an artificial intelligence-powered virtual tutor to support student learning. Students activate the tutor as they're studying, and it will ask questions about the content that they're then studying. The tutor provides answers or signposts the student to additional resources that might be helpful. And it can also automatically generate quiz questions and things like paraphrasing practices to help the students assess their knowledge. So the tutor is particularly suited to supporting students on reading heavy or text heavy courses, and can be a helpful aid for students also with learning difficulties or who simply need some extra help. For the university, the tutor provides a scalable and cost-effective way to provide really personalized real-time support to students. So students get the answers they need during that 3 a.m. revision or writing marathon. And it also means that university staff are not necessarily spending a lot of time answering simpler and more basic questions. And then also the tutor usage data is captured. So universities then have the ability to use that data, potentially combine it with other data that they have about students to help identify students who might be struggling or who simply might need extra support. But students don't only need academic support on demand. Students have all kinds of questions all the time about course schedules, about university processes or general administration. And that's why Google Cloud introduced the virtual 24/7 support tool. This tool is, again, an artificial intelligence powered bot that students can access from any device, any time, and on pretty much any channel. It can use multiple languages, so students who don't speak the institution's primary language as their first language can access help in their native language quite easily. What's really helpful for students is that students with more complex needs can then be triaged to a university staff member. So essentially the tool can act as a filtration system, only sending through students who really need to speak to a person and therefore saving potentially a huge amount of staff time. And then the tool can be used to identify students at risk. And this in some ways is similar to what I explored with the personalised tutor, that the model can be trained to flag up particular patterns of behaviour or certain questions or issues or patterns. And again, you can combine this with other information from other university data sources, and that can potentially automatically trigger a notification to other university staff to potentially take action. And this ability to capture data at scale really helps universities keep a closer eye on students that need it, while also providing a seamless experience for students who have common questions. Two examples that we have in North America of this are Penn State World Campus, who found that 90% of the common questions could be answered automatically by their AI-powered service, with personalised answers being routed to the student. And SEI built a student assistant that again handles over 90% of their live chat volume. And that does things that include suggesting learning paths, answers enrolment questions and issues. So some quite sophisticated and complex questions. Finally, we all know that one of the big challenges that universities have faced in the past year is the very dramatic shift to online distance learning. And two of the big questions that we've heard and have spent time solving for are: how can we replicate the in-person learning experience as closely as possible? And how can we make the learning experience as seamless as possible, even though students can't come into the classroom? And there's two ways that the Google Cloud Student Success Services are solving for these challenges. First, Google Workspace for Education, previously known as G Suite for Education, provides a very comprehensive learning experience that's intuitive for users, very cost effective for the institution, and highly integrated, so students and staff have everything they need in one place. And crucially, it's accessible from pretty well any device anywhere and is simple to adopt, as many, if not most students and staff are pretty familiar with using some of the core tools in their personal lives. And Workspace also has a wealth of other useful features specifically designed for education, including something called originality reports, which is built-in plagiarism detection that can be very helpful. The second tool that helps universities provide a seamless and distance learning experience is virtual desktops. Virtual desktops allow students to replicate the experience they might have on a high-powered computer in an on-campus lab at their home computer or device. So they're essentially accessing the compute power remotely. So for example, they're able to work on highly complex 3D modeling or run complicated simulations that otherwise would be impossible to do at distance on what might be a very low-cost personal device. So taking advantage of the university's facilities. And we're continuing to work on these innovations. The solutions that I've outlined earlier are all modular services that universities can access and adopt now. But they're really only the beginning of what Google's vision is for using technology to transform education, in particular to free up staff time to focus on more creative, on innovative research and on teaching. And one way we're currently innovating is to do further work on the personalised tutor to start getting into generating course materials for staff. So generating quiz questions, reading lists, structuring the content, proposing lesson content, and so on. And the really fundamental idea around this is to try and take as many of the manual and laborious tasks off the plate of staff, so that staff can spend rather more time doing the more creative, valuable, and intellectually demanding work that chances are probably find more rewarding. But that's really just one way, and we'd be really keen to hear from you about where we should be focusing our innovative efforts. So that brings me to the end of this brief presentation. Thanks very much for listening, and I think now we'll be moving on to the panel discussion.
That's right, brilliant. Thank you very much, Jim. Just there we are. Jim, there's a couple of notes about your microphone level being a little bit low, so I was wondering if you could perhaps just check that to make sure that it's okay. We'll dive right into the panel discussion. We have about half an hour. It should be plenty of time to get stuck in. When we talk about AI-powered tools and other teaching and learning innovations that can be utilised by universities, I'm interested to hear the point of view from our university leaders here today about what they have found effective and what they have found challenging during this process. Perhaps what the sort of cultural shift required is at their university in order to introduce these type of tools. Marie, perhaps can we come to you first?
Thank you, Alistair. Well, I think there are almost two phases in this. There's the pre-COVID phase and then COVID afterwards. So in the pre-COVID phase, in terms of the culture around AI and what it can do and tools to support learning, perhaps wouldn't have generated the same interest in relation to what its capabilities are for a lot of people. In terms of the COVID scenario, particularly in University College Dublin, everybody had to scale up extremely quickly, and with that learning, then there was a realization of looking for new ways of doing things, and that in itself, I suppose, generated a degree of new interest. And as we go through this, I suppose there's the whole issue of how can we use our approaches to create the optimal learning environment for our students in relation to it. And I suppose the challenge around it is how to use the data ethically and responsibly that comes from that. I mean, in terms of innovative teaching approaches, one of the things our teaching fellows looked at prior to COVID was metacognition and the digital learning environment, and really to help students become more self-aware of their own learning. And I mean, that ran across disciplinary in veterinary, sports science and information and communication studies. And out of that, we're looking at taking that kind of approach with our VLE in terms of supporting the learner in that way. And then we have another project called Flourish going on with Dublin City University, which is supporting the well-being of students in the digital environment. So those are the kind of innovations that were happening pre-COVID, but at a lower scale. And now, as a result of COVID, much more interest in relation to what's going on. But the challenges are beginning to emerge as to how it's done.
What are the biggest challenges you say you're facing? Is it a technological one or a cultural one, or are they both?
I think it's both, because as people become more aware of what the technology can do, then they're asking more questions of what more it can do. But then there are issues around GDPR, there are issues around data, the ethics that underpin it in terms of the support, and I suppose not wanting to lose the personalised learning environment that a lot of our students have struggled with in COVID. And it is our stage 1 students, for example, who've never been in UCD, have enjoyed the learning experience, are very open to it in the online context, but what they miss is the connection in the classroom and making friends and getting to know classmates. And that's the kind of thing that is challenging in terms of trying to provide the learning experiences.
Great, thank you very much, Marie. Tracy, I'll come to you next. How has the University of York been handling those issues, and what additional support has been required for students and staff during this period? And are things like AI assisted tools helping?
Yeah, so I'm going to say exactly partly what Marie said in some ways, which was actually there's a pre and post-COVID element to this, and I'll pick up on the post-COVID as well. So I think we've learned an awful lot during this space as well about what students want and how students learn in a very different way. And I think that's something it's helped us move very quickly forward about what we might even do in the future in that space. In terms of AI and tools, AI is something we're looking at moving forward with more within our online programs that we already offer. Very much what Jim's already said in terms of how do we do that, that's personalised support for students, in particular the thinking about those frequently asked questions in a very different way, and rather than just reading a web page, just actually having somebody answer can help in that space. I think similarly as well, immersive technologies are key here. A lot of our efforts are looking at how we widen access to education. How do we at a global level enable students to get a degree from York without having to set foot on campus in that way? And I think this is where sort of immersive technologies come in, and they combine with online degrees. They also allow universities to offer degrees and specialisms that they may not also have the facilities, the full facilities to do. So I think there's a lot we can learn there. Again, in terms of AI, one of the areas we're looking at the moment, we were starting to look at anyways, for marking and feedback. I think that there's ways of doing this that provides a level of consistency to students as well. I think that's one of the challenges that we see in our NSS scores that come through is assessment and feedback's great, but there's a lack of consistency. So how can we use technology to improve consistency, and in particular, as we see more cross-departmental, cross-faculty degrees where practices vary tremendously. And I think for me, this is where some of the technologies can help in that consistency of approach for students moving forward. I think in terms of the challenges, I think it's about confidence often of staff to move to using new tools and that digital upskilling piece. It's very easy, I won't say it was easy, when we all got thrown in at the deep end because of the pandemic, we had no choice but to learn. There was no alternative. I think we need to harness how we've done that and move forward and increase staff confidence. I think one other note of caution is simple can often be best as well. There is a danger of overloading both staff and students with too many tools. So one of the things we're looking at is having like a toolkit moving forward that we use for, whether that's for community building. So we use Google quite a lot, is what our provider is, but we're using Slack as well, and how we integrate the tools together to make it seamless for students, but also not overcomplicated. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Tracy. To that point about scalability and also keeping things as simple as possible, Alejandra, could we ask you a little bit about your work at your institution and how much that plays a role in the strategies that you're devising now?
Well, I think they do play a big role in the devices in the strategies that we're devising now, particularly the digital success plan that is in approaching its completion now. And I thought for the purposes of this conversation today, it might be good to consider some first principles to frame the sort of work that we are doing at Portsmouth, and I know others are doing across the sector, that might help us better understand the role that very exciting and powerful tools like AI applications can play. So one of perhaps the first principle here is a good teaching practice is a solid starting point for meaningful technology adoption by students and by staff. So in other words, if you want to grow digital, or if you want to growth in digital, then teaching well is a good starting point. And that takes me to the next principles, some of which might be controversial, but for the purposes of opening up the discussion around this, I would argue that unless your name is Netflix or Disney, content is not king. Context is. In other words, what matters is not the content per se, but what students and tutors do with it, why they do it, how they do it, and who they do it with. The third principle, the way to design for effective learning is to redesign. In the same way as the best way to write is to rewrite, we apply that to the process of learning design. The fourth principle is very much about a very operational one in terms of time spent on a team approach to learn and design. I would argue that that time is very well invested. It does pay off despite very busy schedules. And the final one, I would argue that we should not confuse teaching with content delivery. We should not confuse content with learning. They may overlap, but access to content is one thing, access to learning is another. And incidentally, there are many things we can do with, in, on, and about learning, but deliver is not one of them. So in this context, my question, and maybe we can discuss possible answers to it, is to what extent can the learning design process be automated, perhaps through AI applications? And I'm very happy to tackle that myself, but before I do that, I realize I've spoken for a few minutes already, so I'll hand back to you, Alistair.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Jim, I'd like to bring you in on this at some point, but I'd like to go to Marie and Tracy first, just to say if they have any experience of automating the learning design process in the way that Alejandro is talking about.
Not really. It's just a case that I mean, the principles that he has talked about are ones that we would agree with. I mean, we've been promoting a digital strategy, and it's very important part of our education strategy in terms of doing that. But absolutely agree. And having used my own VLE, it's exactly the point. You know, you start with the teaching principles and you work your way through that. It's not about content delivery at all in that regard. But and I too would be very interested to hear how that can be supported in the way that Alejandro has talked about.
Thank you. Well, perhaps Jim, we could come to you to speak about this, because you name-checked a couple of big projects and collaborations that Google has in North America, where you've helped to automate not just things like administrative support for enrollments, but also suggesting student pathways. Is that something that is scalable over a relatively short period? I mean, what are the timescales and what are the feedback loops that need to be established in order to grow a project to that size?
So these projects, and something that I think is consistent across all the things that I spoke about, is that each of these things can potentially start off very, very small, in that you can very, very quickly and at quite a low cost put in, for example, a simple support chatbot with a set of standard rules in the background to answer and filter out basic questions, and then very rapidly potentially triage those through to a real person. And most of us are familiar with that sort of technology on consumer websites, for example, where those sometimes rather annoying things pop up, would you like to chat? So you can start very small, but then scale up and start to connect to multiple data sources to start to look at multiple pieces of information related to the individual, to start making, for example, these suggestions on programs, which needs quite a lot of different information based on knowing who the student or the applicant may be. I think with learning and the AI tutor, we have been doing that very much in partnership with the pilot institutions we've worked in the States. I mean, I am not an educator, and there are some educators in Google Cloud, but most of us are not educators. So we do come to this with quite a lot of humility, in that we've got the underpinning technology. Then it's about working with the academics about the materials and the pedagogy that they're looking to put together, and then how can we use this technology, which can, has the ability to scan through an enormous amount of material. I'm deliberately trying to avoid the word content, but material, data structures, and insight, and then start to automate aspects of it. And one of the easiest things to automate is our questions. But then also there are things like paraphrasing practice to start testing understanding. And again, it's around interpreting very large amounts of data and then applying some models to that. That, you know, it becomes a lot more complicated, and the collaborations continue around how do you start proposing pathways and start proposing course design, because that clearly needs more data and then more work with academic partners as to how they would approach it, so that, you know, the AI can then start to learn and start to apply that knowledge. Okay,
thank you very much, Jim. Alejandra, to come back to you, one of the points you made about how sort of the best learning design is the redesign of that process. How has that been implemented at Portsmouth? And how are you? Is it a collaboration between staff and students, or management and staff? I mean, what are the sort of feedback and data that you're gathering to sort of to redesign things effectively?
Well, I recently joined Portsmouth, so I am in the process of disseminating and making structured approaches to learning design part of the way we operate as a standard practice, not as an additional task. So what we've done in previous roles, when I was Dean of Learning and Teaching at Northampton and elsewhere, I and other colleagues have deployed very well established, well researched approaches to team-based learning design. And there's quite a bit written on these. So things like the Carpe Diem approach, which we adapted accordingly, things like the ABC model that we've adapted accordingly, things like that have been in use for many, many years now. So at Northampton alone, for example, we ran in excess of 500 of those workshops over a period of 5 years to completely redesign the entire portfolio of the university to what we called active blended learning. That was the tool we used to scale it up. And it was not exactly AI based, it was very human based, but that enabled us to shift approaches to learning and teaching. It helped us to instill particular types of ideas in the design process, which had then to be matched onto appropriate teaching practices that would capitalize on those approaches. So we have to bear in mind that the design bit of it, and that relates to one of the questions in the Q&A, the design side of it addresses some key considerations in pedagogical considerations, but they have to be sort of matched with appropriate teaching practices. And one of the big issues we have in the sector is not many academics have been trained to teach. Professional recognition is one thing. A teaching qualification is a very different thing, and we've got to be aware of this.
Thank you very much. So to your point about the questions from the audience, I apologize. I meant to mention that we will try and carve out 5 or 10 minutes at the end to take questions in a row. There's about 200 people in the audience today, so we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. And thank you all for joining us. Maria, I saw a sort of wry smile at Alejandra's point about the academics and teaching in terms of, you know, how you measure that and improve that and offer constructive feedback. Is this something where, when we look at learning design more broadly, you are perhaps facing another cultural challenge if you integrate AI tools for delivery models? Is it something that is hard to get people to adopt and hard to get people to accept because they can perhaps see it as a challenge to their own teaching credentials?
Well, that's true, and in terms of how they understand teaching and what it means, and if they haven't got the practice in it in terms of understanding how you go about designing something, because that's one thing that COVID did when we all had to transfer very quickly online, was you had to go back to first principles in your own teaching, and things that have been taken for granted in terms of how people gave lectures, how they prepared material, how they delivered it, all had to be rethought. And for some that was a big shock. For others, they embraced it extremely well. So it's a mix mix of approaches. In our teaching and learning supports, I mean, we have modules on teaching in an online context, same for assessment, conducting online assessment, all of these kind of things. But unless people can sit down, I think I like the idea of the team-based approach, sitting down together and trying to work through what it is you want to achieve in your module, but how it links to the modules that make up the program, and that there's a consistency of experience for our students in that, because they need to be exposed to different types of learning medium in order to make them skills ready for the future, and to participate in a very changing world. So and some don't see the need for this, but there are lots of people who really embraced it and started to explore the VLE way beyond what we would have expected in terms of its potential and what it could try to do.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tracy, I'd like to come to you next, just to ask, I'll try and address some of these questions as we go now, but there is one concern that's been raised by one of the questions, which is about how to avoid academics or teachers feeling isolated by this process. Obviously, a teams-based approach mitigates that slightly. Is there ways of incorporating new digital tools and new data gathering that can help you with some useful metrics and benchmarks that your teaching staff can use as for support, basically, and to help them improve?
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to, I think, reflect on one of the things Jim said is exactly an important point. Technology is an enabler. It's to enhance, it's not the driver. And I think that's one of the challenges, that if we can get that message right to academic staff and to students, I think that's really helpful. I think in terms of how we use data, I'm going to go back to something we did pre-pandemic. Lecture capture, I think, is a really important one. We all probably have used lecture capture, and there's been concerns about how capturing lectures impacts on attendance at sessions, and we see sessions going down. That data is really useful data for lots of reasons. One, when you can then go back and see where students have looked at the slides in a different way, where they've hovered over. That information, some departments have used this really well to then go back and understand how the lectures can be improved. What are the points, the sticking points that students understand? So I think you can use that data in an iterative way. I think in terms of the more personalised learning journey for students, I think it's going back to first principles though as well. What is a typical, there is no typical student journey, and I think you have to map out that student journey to understand what some of the key touch points are. And then to make sure that the data is collected at the appropriate time point, that it's robust, and that also students, I think, understand why that data is being collected. And I think the biggest challenge then is making that data accessible to both students and staff in a meaningful way. We talked about this many years ago to do with attendance capture data, and I don't want to, so MyFitnessPal was an example we used at the time. You get that nice little dashboard about what have you eaten, you can put your diary requirements in, and it tells you about your carbohydrates, tells you about your protein, it tells you about your fat. But we were looking at how you display the data back to students that's meaningful. That also then means that when a student and a supervisor has a meaningful discussion about this, they both understand that the page they're coming from. Having large spreadsheets is not helpful or conducive to anyone. So I think the personalised learning journey is something that's really, really important, but only if the data is good that goes into it, but it's used appropriately at the end of it. Because I think there's a concern certainly with some communities. From a student point of view, it's Big Brother watching you, but from a staff, understanding the data to do it. So I think we've got a lot to learn, but I think it's something as a sector we could learn together in order then that we set almost sector standards on this as well. I think it's important that there are standards about how we do this. And I think Marie made a really important point at the start of this, is it's the ethical use of that data as well. And I think that's key.
Great, thank you very much, Tracy. We've got about 5 minutes left. I just want to try and fire another couple of quick questions at the panel and see if anyone's got any any reflections on these. One question we had early on was, Robert Curry asked, I'm interested in how AI can help connect to library e-resources, reading lists or other constructively aligned content to ensure relevance and quality of content. Do the panel have any examples of how the library resource at their institutions have been augmented and bolstered and through the use of AI tools? Is it an area where you're integrating automation yet? No? Okay. Jim, would you?
I mean, I could quickly comment that that's effectively what we're building with the AI tutor, that it's very much about getting those resources in a digital form into the AI tutor to start to be able to help augment the students' learning. So yeah, that's exactly effectively what we're doing. Those would be the resources that really inform the tutor. Okay,
thank you. And we've had a couple of questions about assessment and how to integrate AI tools there. I mean, I know there are some innovations such as automated marking and other scalable solutions that people have introduced in different institutions, and also using AI software to make more sophisticated detections around essay mills and other problems such as that. Alejandro, how much is assessment building part of the sort of the learning redesign at Portsmouth?
It's central to it, as any approach that starts with the end in mind. So absolutely central. We don't have efficient AI engines powering that at the moment. This is an area of current expansion or planned expansion, but the processes I described earlier, the team approach to learning design, including staff, students, learning technologists, learning designers, employers, that starts with the end in mind, starts with assessment right at the forefront of it. So we don't have a lot of time to expand on that now, but it is a very exciting part of it, where other tools come into play as well, other end-to-end assessment solutions that do assessment much better than VLEs, I have to say. That's where the discussion gets really exciting.
Okay, great, thank you. Tracy, you made a point earlier about being able to offer a broader curriculum and a more diverse curriculum, and presumably increasing access massively alongside that when it comes to fruition. How much does AI, is there a contribution that AI can make there to managing the assessment process for all of that?
So we're actually just starting to look at that. We're looking at how we can use AI across the piece for our online and distance learning students, very much in what Jim described earlier, with that not the personalised tutor access to start off with, but the bit in the middle, that the sort of standard student support, and how can I find my form for this, and basic things, in particular when students are in essence across all corners of the world. In terms of AI going forward, it's something we're looking at. We've got, ironically, an MSc in computer science with AI, so if we don't do it in that programme, then it would seem a little bit ironic. I think Alexandra's point was key, that it's finding the right tools to do some of this, because I think at the moment, in terms of what's available, you've got different VLEs do one thing, you've got assessment and feedback tools. There's nothing that seems to bring everything together at the moment, and I think that's one of the challenges that we faced with, because what you don't want is students to have to navigate 3 or 4 different systems in order to get to that end-to-end journey. So I think it's needing a solution in some part to do this. In terms of basic AI at the moment, we already do the self-answered questions. You can put out there an answer, you put your own answer, a question, you put your own answer in, it generates something there. But I think it needs to be more sophisticated than that moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. And finally, Mary, just to build on one of the points that Tracy raised there, is there a challenge at your institution around sort of the interoperability of the different platforms that you're asking people to use, and can automation help smooth that journey slightly, make it better?
Yes, there is. I mean, we have introduced a unified support model where there's 120 staff and operational roles, and therefore they're absolutely monitoring the different questions student connector forms, student weekly forms, and that kind of thing. And what's interesting about that is we can match at different points in the year what questions students are asking, what are the tension points is around clinical placements, extenuating circumstances, registration, online application, that kind of thing, and we can compare it to when we started, which was in September 2019. So we have been able to track, and that has been really important in terms of trying to provide support during students when we went online, and that's moving out now to Access and Lifelong Learning, and it's moving into our global area and our support sports area beyond the colleges and the schools. In terms of the assessment, we're trying to work harder to make our assessment reports more meaningful. But in looking at systems and platforms, and as Tracy said, I mean, we need to know what is it we're asking in terms of the answers that we want, because we're swamped with data in lots of ways. And it's to take the time to sit down to see, well, what will help students on their journey, their education journey, their co-curricular journey, their skills acquisition journey, but also like how do we make this data meaningful to support decisions? And that takes time, and it takes a lot of human effort. Okay, so where it's welcome to see all of the opportunities, but just to make good choices around AI, and it's also to be able to use it effectively to support student success, which is what we want to do.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marie. We're almost at time. I just quickly wanted to go to Jim to wrap up, which is to just ask, from a supplier perspective at Google Cloud, how much is the requirement for properly supporting assessment with automated tools increasing in the conversations that you're having with your partners?
It's certainly part of the discussion, but I think the other contributors have really just commented on the challenges around it. There are still a wealth of different tools around. I think our approach is very much around working with a lot of the systems and tools that universities have, and then really bringing together that data in a single, easy to use canvas, if you like, for the users. But yes, it's certainly part of the discussion, and there's an awful lot of innovation going on. There are startups constantly being created to also handle this. So yes, it's certainly a frequent source of discussion. But I think from our perspective, it's about how can we integrate to ultimately make the experience for the academic and the student as easy and seamless as possible, rather than putting in yet another apparently completely different tool in place.
Great, thank you, Jim. Yeah, the conversation around supporting spin-outs and startups with AI from university bases is probably another discussion in itself. But that takes us to time. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for the panel for their insights. An on-demand version of this recording will be available on the Times Higher Education website, along with a summary article. As I say, this is part of a series of webinars that we are doing with Google Cloud. So please do we'll keep you posted on any further installments in that we have planned. So thank you to Marie, to Tracy, to Alejandro, and to Jim, and we will leave things there. Thank you very much.